In ancient Egypt, the temples of the gods were magnificent structures, towering symbols of civilization, faith, and divine order. But beneath the polished granite and elaborate hieroglyphs lay a hidden reality, a system of servitude, control, and moral collapse that defined the lives of thousands of women. This is not a myth of pharaohs and curses, but a documented historical truth about the profound darkness that can be engineered in the name of piety. It is the story of girls taken as children, their identities systematically erased, their bodies repurposed, and their freedom permanently revoked. Imagine a child standing before the towering walls of the Temple of Amun, a girl named Nefertari, barely 9 years old. Her father, unable to settle a debt with the temple's vast economic empire, settled it with his own daughter. This was not an honor, it was a transaction, a life traded for grain. When the cold bronze razor scraped across her scalp, removing the long braids that were her last link to childhood, Nefertari began to cry. An older priestess struck her across the face, whispering the terrible lesson of her new existence. You have no tears left, no name left. You belong to Amun now. Nefertari was not unique. She was one of countless women who lived and died within those sacred walls, bearing titles that sounded divine, wives of the god, servants of the goddess, but were, in truth, captives of a powerful religious economic machine. Their confinement was absolute, their servitude unending. To understand the fate of these women, we must first shatter the modern romantic illusion of the elegant, respected priestess. The reality, meticulously catalogued in papyri and temple archives, points to a vast apparatus of systemic exploitation hidden behind ritual perfection. The most common term for these women was hemet, meaning servant or wife of the god. Crucially, the concept of purity applied to them was not about sexual innocence as we know it, but ritual purity, a state imposed and defined solely by the temple hierarchy. This purity was a leash. It meant being untouched by the profane, which effectively meant being strictly controlled and accessible only to the priests who claimed to represent the deity. Their lives became a perpetual act of submission, enforced through spiritual threats and physical isolation. Most of these women never chose this path. They were surrendered by families seeking divine favor, dedicated to the temple to relieve poverty, or, like Nefertari, handed over as payment for debt. The temples were not just centers of worship, they were the central banks of Egypt. When families defaulted, daughters became currency. This state-sanctioned human transfer was religious devotion in public, but an effective form of human trafficking in private. The girl was given away and typically never returned home. Even darker were the girls taken as tribute. Egyptian armies sweeping through conquered lands from Nubia to the Levant often seized young women and delivered them directly to the temple system. They were absorbed into a spiritual servitude from which no escape was possible. The ages of entry recorded in ancient documents are shocking. Initiates often began their service as young as 8 or 9 years old before puberty, incapable of informed consent or understanding the contract of permanent loss they had entered. Consider the story of Mutamuya, an 8-year-old taken from her Nubian village as tribute. Tied together with 12 others, she was forced to march hundreds of kilometers north. She did not speak Egyptian, and her cries were quickly silenced by a guard's brutal blow. Mutamuya learned to cry in silence. When she finally arrived at the Temple of Mut in Thebes, she was dedicated to the goddess of motherhood, Atum. Profound and cruel irony for a child who would be forever denied the right to become a legitimate mother herself. The process of turning children like Nefertari and Mutamuya into possessions was intentionally designed for complete psychological and emotional annihilation. It began with rituals meant to strip away every aspect of their former identity. The first was the purification by water. The child was undressed and washed repeatedly in a sacred pool. This cleansing, framed as necessary for ritual purity, was often a deeply invasive examination, performed by priests under the guise of holy inspection. When Nefertari was brought to the stone pool, she hesitated, but her clothes were torn away. As a priest began to touch her under the pretense of purifying her, he seized her arm and warned coldly, "The gods are watching. They are testing your obedience." This initial traumatic violation set the tone for her life, teaching her that her body was not her own, but an asset of the temple. It was sacred duty covering profound coercion. Following the purification came the shaving ritual, removing every strand of hair. Officially meant to preserve purity, deity. Its true function was to destroy individuality. Hair symbolized personal pride. Its removal was the systematic erasure of self. The final symbolic death was the renaming. Her birth name, the one connecting her to family and memory, was stripped away forever. She was given a new identity, beautiful as the lady, beloved of Amun, and ordered never to speak her true name again. She was no longer her father's daughter, but a creature molded by the temple, a living offering belonging entirely to the deity. But the darkest ritual came next, binding them permanently, the divine marriage ceremony. Each girl was symbolically married to the god she was destined to serve. Dressed in ornate white linen, she would swear vows of eternal service before the towering statue of the deity. The priests recorded this as a holy union, but it was a legal contract of ownership. Mutamuya, at 10 years old, repeated the chilling words in the dark sanctuary. I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever. That vow sealed her fate. Life within the temple was structured to eliminate all autonomy. They woke before sunrise in communal dormitories. Privacy was non-existent. The days were filled with monotonous labor, weaving, grinding grain, cleaning, all disguised as holy service. But the most brutal control mechanism was silence. The women were forbidden to speak unless addressed. This silence severed human connection, preventing friendship, trust, or organized resistance. They were surrounded by others, yet completely isolated. When Nefertari and her friend Takayat were caught whispering at the looms, the supervisor struck Takayat fiercely. For 3 days, Takayat was gone. When she returned, her eyes were lifeless. She never spoke again, a visible lesson in the cost of breaking the silence. Surveillance was absolute, movements were restricted, and contact with families was forbidden. The women were trapped not just by stone walls, but by a crippling psychological conditioning that taught them escape was impossible, and that the priests spoke with divine authority. This conditioning led to the final, horrifying betrayal, the sacred union rituals. Certain high-ranking women were selected for ceremonies described in inscriptions as reenactments of divine myths, meant to ensure the fertility of the land. In these rituals, the high priest, often masked and dressed in divine garments, claimed to physically embody the god himself. The women were told they were about to receive the god's blessing, and that resistance would bring divine wrath upon all of Egypt. The ceremony was performed in the inner sanctuary. When Nefertari was selected at age 14, she was led before the high priest, who approached her, instructing her to submit completely to the god's will. She froze, recoiling when his hands reached out to remove her garments. He warned her that refusal was blasphemy. What followed was recorded as a sacred union, but it was, in reality, a ritualized violation, coercion disguised as religious duty. These acts often resulted in pregnancy. The children were officially declared blessed, yet they were undeniable proof of the abuse inflicted upon their mothers. Daughters were raised to enter the same system. Sons were trained to become priests, perpetuating the cycle. When Nefertari realized she was pregnant, she gave birth to a daughter. She cared for the child for 3 brief years before the little girl was taken away to begin her own temple training. Nefertari was forced to watch her daughter endure the same breaking process she had suffered, forbidden even to acknowledge her existence. For those who dared to defy the system, the punishment was swift and absolute. Some faced what records called dedication to the desert, dragged beyond the walls and left to die slowly under the sun, without food or water. When a woman named Ranutma Hait publicly shouted, "This is not holy, we are prisoners," she was instantly seized. Every woman was forced to watch as she was led into the desert and abandoned, a stark, terrifying declaration of the price of resistance. Most of the temple women spent their entire lives in enforced service, dying within those massive stone enclosures. When they died, they were often buried in unmarked mass graves, their names erased from the official memory of the temple. When Nefertari died at 52, her body was placed in a pit alongside others. Her own daughter, now grown and serving the same gods, was forbidden to mourn. Yet, a silent resistance survived, etched into hidden corners of the stone chambers. Mutamuya, the Nubian girl, left her final profound message, scratched onto the wall of a dark chamber days before her death. It was a reclaiming of self against the force of the empire that sought to erase her completely. I came from beyond the first waterfall. My mother's name was Manatori. I remember her voice, the etching read. I never forgot who I was before they took me. This life was not my choice. If you find this, know that I lived, know that I remembered. Today we marvel at the magnificence of the Egyptian temples, admiring the vast scale of their architecture. But behind the painted scenes of divine glory were women like Nefertari and Mutamuya, whose suffering built the foundation of that power. Their stories are the whispered truth that the official history tried to bury. When you look at those ancient stones, you must see them differently, not merely as monuments to faith, but as monuments of oppression. The temples still stand, the stones still remember, and through the fragmented words of those who resisted, we remember them too.